I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would disappear from their own family's life. But the day my son-in-law Brandon cornered me in my kitchen with that smug look on his face, something inside me changed forever. I can still hear his voice, dripping with false concern as he placed his hand on my shoulder. Eleanor, we need to talk about your finances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was 67 years old, a widow for just over 2 years, and living quite comfortably in the modest 3-bedroom home Frank and I had paid off decades ago. My daughter Laura had married Brandon 8 years earlier, and I'd always had reservations about him. There was something calculated behind those practiced smiles, something cold in the way his gaze lingered on people's possessions, assessing their worth. But I kept these thoughts to myself. Laura seemed happy, or at least she convinced herself. She was. And that was what mattered. They had 2 beautiful children, my grandchildren, and for their sake, I maintained a cordial relationship with Brandon, inviting them for Sunday dinners and never commenting when he'd forget his wallet whenever we went out. The day everything changed, they had come over unannounced. Laura immediately took the kids upstairs to find some old toys I'd kept in the spare room. That's when Brandon followed me into the kitchen as I put on a pot of coffee. Your finances, he repeated, leaning against my counter with unearned familiarity. Laura and I have been talking, and we're concerned. I set down the coffee pot and raised an eyebrow. Concerned about what exactly? Brandon smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're living alone in this big house, managing all these bills and responsibilities by yourself. It's a lot for someone your age. My age? I couldn't help but laugh. Brandon, I'm 67, not 97. I've been managing my finances since before you were born. His smile tightened. Of course, Eleanor. I'm just saying it would make more sense to simplify things. Laura and I have been talking about it, and we think you should sell this place. Property values in this neighborhood have skyrocketed. You could make a small fortune. And then what? I asked, though I already knew where this was heading. We could add an in-law suite to our place. You'd have your own space but be close to family, to the grandkids. He said that last part with emphasis, knowing it was my weak spot. And with the proceeds from the house sale and your retirement savings, you could really help secure all our futures. There it was. The real reason for his sudden concern about my well-being. Frank's life insurance, I said flatly. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Frank had always been careful with money, and when he passed, he left me with a comfortable nest egg, $387,000 in life insurance, plus our retirement savings and the house. Not a fortune by any means, but enough to keep me comfortable for the rest of my years if I was careful. Brandon's expression flickered for just a moment before he recovered. This isn't about the money, Eleanor. It's about what makes sense for the family. We're thinking long-term here. I turned away from him and busied myself with the coffee cups. I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly happy right where I am. He moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper even though we were alone. Look, I know you think I'm being selfish here, but Laura and I are struggling. The housing market is insane. Interest rates are through the roof, and the kids private. School tuition is killing us. I looked at him incredulously. The private school that I told you was unnecessarily expensive? The one you insisted they attend because it would give them connections? That's not fair, he said, a flash of genuine anger breaking through his polished veneer. We're doing what's best for them. Don't you want your grandchildren to have every advantage? Of course I do, I said. That's why I've already set up college funds for both of them. Brandon's eyes widened, and I could practically see the dollar signs flashing in his pupils. You have? How much? That's between me and them when they turn 18. I cut him off. Now, shall we join Laura and the kids? He didn't bring it up again that day, but I knew this wasn't the end of it. Brandon had the look of a predator who had caught the scent of prey, and apparently that prey was me, or rather, my savings. Over the next few weeks, the pressure intensified. Laura started calling daily, always starting with casual conversation before steering toward the same topics. How big my house was for just one person. How unsafe the neighborhood had become. It hadn't. How much I'd love being closer to the grandkids. Then came the accidental emails, financial planning articles about right-sizing and retirement, links to assisted living facilities, despite my perfect health, and spreadsheets showing the financial benefits of pooling family resources. Brandon had even created a mock-up floor plan of their proposed in-law suite, a glorified bedroom with a bathroom that was about a quarter of the size of my current home. I felt the noose tightening, and for a moment, I considered giving in. Maybe they were right. Maybe at my age, I should be thinking about downsizing. But then I found the listing. It was a pure accident. I was scrolling through real estate sites, curious about what comparable homes in my neighborhood were selling for, when I saw my own house. There it was, clearly photographed from the street, listed as coming soon. A 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom single-family home in an excellent school district, perfect for young families. The listing agent? Brandon Reynolds of Reynolds Reality. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. My son-in-law had listed my home for sale without my knowledge or consent. The initial shock gave way to a cold, clarifying anger I hadn't felt since Frank caught, a contractor trying to scam us on our roof repair back in '98. I picked up the phone and called Laura. "Mom?" she answered, sounding surprised. I rarely called during her workday. "Laura, I just saw my house listed on Zillow Homes. Care to explain?" A long pause. "Oh, that. It's not what you think." "Really? Because it looks like your husband is trying to sell my house out from under me." "Mom, it's just..." Brandon thought it would be good to test the market, see what kind of interest we might get. Nothing would happen without your approval, of course. "My approval?" I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I never approved listing my home, Laura. I don't want to sell my home. I've made that abundantly clear." "I know, but if you saw the numbers, you might change your mind. The market is so hot right now and..." "Laura," I interrupted, "does your husband have power of attorney over me?" "What? No, of course not. Has a doctor declared me mentally incompetent?" "Mom, don't be ridiculous. Then explain to me how either of you thinks you have the right to list my property for sale." Another long silence. When she spoke again, her voice had hardened. "We're just trying to help you, Mom. You're not getting any younger, and it makes no sense for you to rattle around in that big house all by yourself. Dad would want you to be practical about this." The mention of Frank was a low blow, and we both knew it. Frank had always been the practical one, the steady hand that kept our finances on track, but he had also been fiercely protective of our independence. "Don't you dare tell me what your father would want," I said, my voice shaking. "Your father would be appalled at what you're trying to do." "That's not fair," Laura said, her voice rising. "Brandon and I are just looking out for everyone's best interests. Why are you being so selfish? Don't you care about your grandchildren's future?" And there it was, the emotional manipulation wrapped in a guilt trip. I took a deep breath. "I'm going to hang up now, Laura. I expect that listing to be taken down within the hour. If it's not, my next call will be to my lawyer." I ended the call and sat at my kitchen table, staring at nothing. The house Frank and I had bought when Laura was just a toddler, where we'd marked her height on the doorframe of the pantry, where Frank had taught her to ride a bike in the driveway. The home, where we'd celebrated countless Christmases, birthdays, and anniversaries. The place where Frank had spent his final days, surrounded by familiar comforts as cancer slowly claimed him, and they wanted to sell it out from under me, take my savings, and stick me in a glorified guest room. All so Brandon could maintain. his image as a successful provider, driving his luxury car and sending his kids to an overpriced private school they didn't need. The listing was removed within 20 minutes. But the damage was done. Something fundamental had broken between Laura and me. Or perhaps I was just finally seeing what had been broken for a long time. Either way, I knew I couldn't trust them anymore. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the subtle signs I'd ignored over the years, the way Brandon's eyes would linger on the antique silver service Frank's mother had left us, how he'd casually ask about my investment portfolio during family dinners, the time he'd suggested I add him as a signatory on my accounts, just in case something happens, barely 6 months after Frank's funeral. By morning, I'd made my decision. If they wanted my money so badly, fine. But they wouldn't get it, and neither would I. I spent the next week doing research, making calls, and setting up appointments. I was careful to use my neighbor's Wi-Fi when searching online. Marge had given me her password years ago when my internet was down during a storm, and I used cash to buy a prepaid phone for certain calls. I didn't know if Brandon or Laura would be monitoring my activities, but I couldn't take the chance. 10 days after discovering the listing, I met with my longtime attorney, Philip Garfield. Phil had been Frank's fraternity brother and had handled our legal affairs for decades. I knew I could trust him completely. "Eleanor, are you sure about this?" Phil asked after I laid out my plan. "It's rather extreme." "I'm sure, Phil. I've thought of nothing else for days. They've already tried to sell my house without my consent." "What do you think they'll do next?" Phil sighed, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "Unfortunately, I've seen this scenario play out before. Once adult children get it into their heads that they're entitled to their parents' assets, things can get ugly fast. But there are other options. We could set up a trust with strict conditions, or no," I said firmly. "I've made up my mind. This isn't just about protecting the money anymore. It's about teaching them a lesson. Revenge rarely brings the satisfaction we hope for, Eleanor." I smiled sadly. "This isn't about revenge, Phil. It's about justice, and maybe, just maybe, it will make Laura realize what she's become before it's too late." Phil didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "All right, I'll draw up the paperwork, but promise me you'll give this one more week to think it over. A decision like this, there's no going back." I agreed, but I already knew my mind wouldn't change. For the next week, I went about my business as usual. I attended my book club, had coffee with friends, and even hosted Sunday dinner for Laura, Brandon, and the kids. Brandon was on his best behavior that evening, obviously worried about the listing fiasco. He brought an expensive bottle of wine, no doubt charged to his perpetually maxed-out credit card, and kept the conversation light. But I noticed how his eyes swept the room, cataloging my possessions like an assessor preparing for an estate sale. After dinner, while Laura was helping me with the dishes, she broached the subject again. "Mom, I want to apologize for how everything happened with the house listing. Brandon got ahead of himself, and it was completely inappropriate." I nodded, accepting the apology with a small smile. "Thank you for saying that." Encouraged by my response, she continued, "But I hope you'll still consider the idea of moving in with us. The kids would love having you around more, and frankly, I worry about you here all alone." "I'm hardly alone, Laura. I have friends, my volunteer work at the library, my garden club. My life is here." She pressed her lips together in frustration. "But don't you want to be part of our lives? The kids are growing up so fast and you're missing so much." "I see the children every week," I pointed out. "More often when you need a babysitter." A flash of guilt crossed her face. "That's not fair, isn't it?" I asked quietly. "Laura, be honest with me. Is this really about wanting me closer, or is it about my money?" Her face flushed. "How can you even ask me that? You're my mother." "Yes, I am, which is why it breaks my heart to see you and Brandon so focused on what I have rather than who I am. She set down the dish towel, her movements sharp with anger. That's a horrible thing to say. Brandon and I have worked hard for everything. We have. Have you? I asked. The down payment for your house. Where did that come from? She looked away. It had come from us, of course. A generous gift when they got married. The cars you drive, the vacations you take, the schools you choose. Are they really within your means, Laura? Or are you living beyond them, always counting on the next commission, the next bonus, or... I hesitated, then finished softly. The next inheritance? I can't believe you're saying this, Laura whispered, tears in her eyes. After everything we've done for you. I almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement. What exactly have you done for me, Laura? We've included you. We've made you part of our lives, invited you to everything. And I'm grateful for that, I said sincerely. I love being part of your lives, especially the children's. But that doesn't entitle you to my home or my savings. She stormed out of the kitchen then, and minutes later they were all leaving, Brandon tight-lipped, the children confused, Laura refusing to meet my eyes. As they pulled away, I felt a profound sadness, but also a sense of clarity. I was making the right decision. The next day, I called Phil and told him to proceed with the plan, and 3 days after that, I began to put it into motion. First, I visited my bank and withdrew a significant amount in cash, not enough to raise alarm bells, but enough to keep me comfortable for a few months. Then I did the same at another bank where I had a smaller account. I closed my safe deposit box, retrieving the jewelry Frank had given me over the years and several important documents. I sold my car to a private buyer 2 towns over, using the excuse that I wasn't driving much anymore. I began donating clothes and personal items to Goodwill, telling neighbors I was just decluttering. I had my mail forwarded to a P.O. box 2 cities away, and through it all, I maintained my normal routine. I didn't want to raise suspicions. I went to my regular hair appointment, attended church, and even made plans to have lunch with Laura the following week, a lunch I knew I wouldn't be attending. The night before my disappearance, I sat alone, in my living room, looking at old photographs. Frank and I on our honeymoon in Niagara Falls, Laura's first day of kindergarten, family vacations, holiday gatherings, quiet moments of ordinary life that now seemed precious beyond measure. I lingered over a photo of Laura on her wedding day. She looked so beautiful, so hopeful. When had she changed? Or had she always been this way, and I just hadn't wanted to see it? Had Frank and I somehow raised a daughter who valued money more than family? The thought was almost too painful to bear. In the end, I tucked just one photo into my purse, Frank and me on our 40th anniversary, his arm around my waist, both of us laughing at something off camera. It was the last good year before his diagnosis, and our happiness radiated from the image. The next morning, I rose early, made myself a final cup of coffee in my kitchen, and took a last walk through the garden Frank had lovingly tended for decades. Then I locked the door, placed the key under the pot of geraniums where I'd told Phil it would be, and walked to the end of the street where a taxi was waiting to take me to the bus station. As the taxi pulled away, I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to waver now. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. My old life was over, and whatever came next would be on my terms, not theirs. By the time Laura and Brandon realized what I'd done, I would be long gone, and they would have to live with the consequences of their greed in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The Greyhound bus rolled out of the station precisely at 8:15 a.m. I settled into my seat by the window, a small suitcase and tote bag containing everything I'd decided to take with me. As the familiar streets of my hometown faded into the distance, a curious mixture of grief and liberation washed over me. 67 years old and starting over. Frank would have called me crazy. Then again, he might have understood better than anyone. I had a well-thought-out plan, one I'd spent weeks perfecting. First stop, Atlanta. From there, I would take another bus to Savannah. The layover between buses was intentional. 6 hours was enough time to visit a particular bank branch, where I'd opened an account under my maiden name the previous month. I had identification documents Phil had helped me secure legally, a process that had begun weeks ago when I first sensed Brandon's intensifying interest in my finances. As the bus hummed along the highway, I thought about what Laura and Brandon might be doing at that very moment. It was a Tuesday. Laura would be at her office, Brandon likely showing houses to some unsuspecting clients. They wouldn't realize I was gone until tonight at the earliest, when Laura's calls to my house went unanswered. More likely, it would be tomorrow or the next day when real concern set in. By then, I would be untrackable. The bus arrived in Atlanta at 2:10 p.m. I took a taxi to the bank, withdrew another significant amount from my new account, and then headed to a small cafe to wait. I ordered tea and a sandwich, watching people rush by outside, all absorbed in their own lives, their own dramas. None of them knew I was in the middle of vanishing. My phone, my old phone, had been turned off and tucked away in my bag. I wouldn't dispose of it yet. That would come later. I'd purchased a new prepaid phone that only 3 people had the number to: Phil, my old college roommate Judith, who lived in Arizona and hadn't met Laura since she was a child, and Marcus, Frank's cousin who lived in Florida. As I sat there, a text came through on the new phone. Package received. All proceeding as discussed. Godspeed. Phil had received the documents I'd sent via courier yesterday, the final piece of my plan. I felt a momentary pang of regret for what I was about to put Laura through, but I pushed it aside. This was a lesson she needed to learn, and perhaps the only way she would ever understand what truly mattered in life. At 7:45 p.m., I boarded the bus to Savannah. By midnight, I was checking into a modest hotel under my maiden name, Eleanor Sullivan. The desk clerk barely glanced at me, just another older woman traveling alone. Invisible, which was exactly what I wanted to be. Sleep didn't come easily that first night. The bed was unfamiliar, the sounds strange. But more than that, the finality of what I'd done was sinking in. For the first time since Frank died, I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. The next morning, I awoke to several texts on my new phone from Judith. Room ready whenever you are. No rush. Love you. From Marcus. Call when you can. All set on this end. And from Phil. It's begun. Call secure line only. I waited until I'd had breakfast and was back in my hotel room before calling Phil from my new phone. "They've realized you're gone," he said without preamble when he answered. "Laura called me in a panic about an hour ago." "What did you tell her?" I asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Exactly what we discussed. That I hadn't heard from you, that I was concerned too, and that I'd call her if I learned anything." "Did she believe you?" Phil's sigh crackled through the phone. "Eleanor, she's frantic. She said she went to your house last night when you didn't answer her calls and found it empty. No car in the garage, closets half empty. She's called the police, but of course, they won't consider me a missing person because I left voluntarily," I finished. "And I'm of sound mind and legally entitled to go wherever I please." "Exactly. Though Brandon apparently tried to suggest you might be experiencing cognitive decline, the officer wasn't buying it, especially since there's no medical history to support that claim." I felt a flash of anger. Of course Brandon would try that angle. "What else?" "Laura found your phone. You left it on the kitchen counter?" "Yes," I said. I wanted them to know I'd left deliberately. I'd also left a brief note. "I'm safe. Please don't look for me. I'll be in touch when I'm ready." No explanation, no forwarding address, just enough to prevent a full-scale police search. Well, she's been calling everyone you know. Your book club friends, your neighbors, the people from church. No one knows anything, of course. And the house key? Did you get it? Yes. It was right where you said it would be. I've secured the property, as we discussed. Good. I had given Phil power of attorney and clear instructions. The house was to be maintained but not sold, no matter how much Laura and Brandon pressured him. Phil would pay the utilities and property taxes from one of my remaining accounts, one that Laura and Brandon knew nothing about. Eleanor, Phil said, his voice softening. She's genuinely worried about you. Maybe you should— No, I cut him off. Not yet. The lesson hasn't sunk in. What if it never does? I closed my eyes, fighting, back tears. Then I'll have my answer, won't I? After hanging up, I sat motionless for several minutes. The thought of Laura frantically calling around, checking hospitals, growing increasingly desperate, it hurt more than I expected. But then I remembered her words. After everything we've done for you. As if being part of their lives was some great charity they'd bestowed upon me rather than me being Laura's mother, the woman who had raised her, loved her unconditionally, and supported her in every way possible. No, I wouldn't waver. Not yet. I spent 3 days in Savannah, giving myself time to decompress and fully embrace my new identity. Eleanor Sullivan, Frank's pet name for me, had been Ellie Sully, a play on my maiden name. Using it now felt like having a small piece of him with me on this journey. On the 3rd day, I took another bus, this time to Jacksonville, Florida. From there, I rented a car, another careful step to obscure my trail, and drove to a small coastal town called Cedar Key. Marcus, Frank's cousin, owned a small vacation rental property there, a collection of modest cottages tucked away on a quiet stretch of coastline. Most were rented to tourists, but one was kept available for family. That's where I would stay, at least for a while. Long enough for the dust to settle, for Laura and Brandon to come to terms with my disappearance, and for the next phase of my plan to unfold. Cedar Key was perfect, remote enough to feel secure, but with enough amenities that I wouldn't feel completely isolated. The cottage itself was simple but comfortable. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a living area with windows that looked out onto the Gulf. Best of all, it had what the rental listings called private beach access, which really meant a worn wooden walkway leading through seagrasses to a stretch of sand that rarely saw visitors. Marcus met me there, helped me bring in my few belongings, and gave me a quick tour of the place. Bathroom leaks a little if you run the shower too long, he warned, and the internet's spotty when it storms. Otherwise, you should be comfortable enough. It's perfect, I assured him, and it was, a sanctuary where I could regroup, think, and move forward with my plan. After showing me how to work the ancient coffee maker and where to find extra blankets, Marcus paused at the door. Frank would have hated what they were trying to do to you, he said quietly. He would have understood why you had to leave. The validation brought tears to my eyes. Thank you for saying that. You sure you'll be okay out here by yourself? Nearest neighbor's half a mile down the beach. I'll be fine, I said with more confidence than I felt. I've got your number and I know where the market is. What more do I need? He smiled, but his eyes remained concerned. Call if you need anything. Anything at all. After he left, I unpacked my meager possessions, made up the bed with the fresh linens Marcus had provided, and stepped out onto the small deck. The sun was setting over the Gulf, painting the sky in spectacular oranges and pinks. Standing there, watching the colors deepen and then gradually fade, I felt a moment of perfect peace. It didn't last, of course. As darkness fell, so did the weight of what I'd done. I'd left behind my home, most of my possessions, my entire support network, and most painfully, my grandchildren. Would they think I'd abandoned them? Would they forget me? Would Laura poison them against me? I spent that night alternating between certainty that I'd done the right thing and crushing doubt. But by morning, resolve had hardened once again. I made coffee, took it out to the deck, and watched pelicans dive for their breakfast in the shallow waters. This was my life now, at least for a while. I might as well embrace it. For the next week, I established a routine. Mornings were for walking on the beach, afternoons for reading or sitting on the deck watching the water. I ventured into town every couple of days for supplies, gradually becoming familiar with the small grocery store, the post office, the little coffee shop where locals gathered. I kept my interactions friendly but brief, offering no personal details, beyond my name. If anyone was curious about the older woman staying in Marcus's cottage, they were too polite, or perhaps too indifferent, to ask. At night, I would call Phil for updates. Laura and Brandon had been to his office 3 times, now demanding answers, insisting he must know where I was. "Brandon's showing his true colors," Phil reported dryly. "Today he threatened to report me to the Bar Association for collusion if I didn't tell them where you are." As if hiding from one's adult children was a crime, I said with a bitter laugh. "Laura's more subdued," Phil continued. "I think she's genuinely frightened. She keeps saying things like, 'I just want to know she's safe,' and 'Tell her we can work this out, whatever it is.'" I closed my eyes, fighting the maternal instinct to comfort my child, to end her suffering. "Has she mentioned the money?" A pause. "Not directly, no, but Brandon has. He's very interested in whether you've withdrawn your savings. I told him I couldn't discuss your financial matters with anyone but you." "How did he take that?" "About as well as you'd expect. He implied that I might be helping you hide assets in anticipation of a competency hearing." I snorted. Always with the competency angle, as if the only explanation for a woman my age not handing over her life savings to her son-in-law must be mental deterioration. "Eleanor," Phil said carefully, "I have to ask again. Are you sure you want to proceed with the next step? Once it's done, it can't be undone." I'd been thinking of nothing else for days. "I'm sure," I said firmly. "Do it." The next step in my plan was both the most drastic and the most important. Phil would file papers with the court showing that 6 months before my disappearance, I had quietly transferred nearly all of my assets, including the life insurance money, into an irrevocable trust. The beneficiaries? My grandchildren, Thomas and Emily. Not Laura, not Brandon, just the children. And they couldn't touch a penny of it until they turned 25. I had appointed Phil as trustee, with Marcus as successor trustee if anything happened to Phil. Brandon and Laura would have no control over the money whatsoever. Furthermore, the trust contained specific provisions about the children's education. The money could be used for college tuition, but not for the exorbitant private school they currently attended. If Brandon and Laura wanted to keep them in that school, they would have to find a way to pay for it themselves. It was a calculated move designed to accomplish 2 things: protect my grandchildren's future and force Laura and Brandon to live within their actual means, not the inflated lifestyle they'd been maintaining on credit and the expectation of my money. "When will they find out?" I asked Phil. "I've scheduled a meeting with them tomorrow afternoon. They think it's to discuss search efforts, but..." He trailed off. "They're going to be furious," I said quietly, to put it mildly. Phil hesitated. "You know they'll contest it." "They can try," I replied with more confidence than I felt. "But we made sure everything was done properly. I was of sound mind, there was no coercion, and the trust is irrevocable. Even if they spent years in court, they'd get nowhere. Legally, you're right, but Eleanor, this won't just be a legal battle. It will be emotional warfare. Are you prepared for that?" Was I? I'd spent decades with Laura as the center of my world. Even when her behavior disappointed me, even when I disagreed with her choices, my love for her had never wavered. Could I stand firm if she truly turned against me? "I have to be," I said finally. "This isn't just about the money anymore. It's about teaching Laura that actions have consequences, that people, even her own mother, aren't just resources to be exploited. After hanging up, I walked down to the beach and stood at the edge of the water, letting the gentle waves wash over my feet. The sun was setting again, another spectacular Gulf Coast display. I thought about what tomorrow would bring. The shock, the anger, the accusations. It would be ugly, painful, perhaps even unforgivable in Laura's eyes. But sometimes, love means making the hardest choices. And sometimes, it means letting go to see if what comes back to you is real. The next evening, my phone rang at precisely 7:03 p.m. It was Phil. I could tell from his voice that the meeting had gone exactly as we'd expected. It was challenging, he said diplomatically. Tell me everything, I replied, settling into the chair on my deck, steeling myself for what was to come. And as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared over the gulf, Phil recounted the meeting that would forever change my relationship with my daughter and son-in-law, a confrontation so explosive that it would set in motion events neither of us could have predicted. Brandon actually lunged across the table at me, Phil said, his voice still holding a note of disbelief. If Laura hadn't grabbed his arm, I think he might have tried to hit me. I closed my eyes, picturing the scene in Phil's tastefully appointed office. Start from the beginning, I urged. I want to hear exactly how it happened. Phil sighed heavily. They arrived 10 minutes early. Brandon was already agitated, pacing, checking his watch, asking my assistant how long the meeting would take. Because they had important matters to attend to. And Laura? Quiet, withdrawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Phil paused. Eleanor, she's taking this hard. I felt the familiar twist of maternal guilt, but pushed it aside. Go on. I invited them into my office, offered them coffee, which Brandon declined rather rudely, and then got straight to the point. I explained that while I understood their concern about your whereabouts, I had something important to discuss regarding your estate planning. How did they react to that? Brandon perked right up. Laura looked confused. I told them that 6 months ago, you had come to me with concerns about estate planning and wealth preservation, that we had discussed various options, and you had decided to establish an irrevocable trust for the benefit of your grandchildren. I could imagine Brandon's expression changing as the implications sank in. And then? Brandon interrupted, asking how much money was involved. When I told him the approximate value, essentially all of your liquid assets except for what you kept for living expenses, his face turned an alarming shade of red. He demanded to know if Laura was a co-trustee or secondary beneficiary. And when you told him she wasn't, he exploded, Phil confirmed. Started shouting that it was elder abuse, that I'd taken advantage of a vulnerable widow, that he'd have my license, said I'd manipulated you into cutting out your own daughter. Despite everything, I felt a flicker of defensive anger on Phil's behalf. I'm sorry you had to endure that. It's not the first time I've been threatened by an angry relative who didn't get what they wanted, Phil said dryly. Estates bring out the worst in people. What about Laura? What did she say? Phil was quiet for a moment. That's the troubling part, Eleanor. At first, she just sat there, stunned. Then she asked, very softly, did Mom say why? Why she would leave me out completely? I swallowed hard. And what did you tell her? The truth, that you were concerned about the pressure being put on you to liquidate your assets for their benefit. That you wanted to ensure your grandchildren's futures without enabling financial dependence from their parents. She didn't take that well, I imagine. No, Phil admitted. That's when she started crying. She said there had been a misunderstanding, that they were just trying to help you, that they were worried about you being alone. Then Brandon cut her off, told her not to buy into this. Bull. And that's when he started making accusations about me colluding with you. The competency angle again? Yes, but more aggressive this time. He said he was going to petition the court for a conservatorship retroactive to before the trust was established, that he'd get medical experts to testify that you couldn't possibly have been of sound mind when you set it up. I snorted. Good luck with that. My last physical was 3 months ago. Dr. Bennett noted in my chart that I was sharp as a tack and stubbornly independent. I pointed out something similar. Phil said. That's when Brandon lunged across the table. After Laura pulled him back, he seemed to realize he wasn't helping his case by acting unhinged. He switched tactics, became very calm, very reasonable. Started talking about how, if we could just locate you, this could all be sorted out as a family. Meaning he could pressure me into undoing the trust somehow. That would be my interpretation, yes. When I explained that the trust was irrevocable, that even you couldn't undo it now, even if you wanted to, that's when he stormed out. Laura followed, but not before turning back to ask me one more question. I tensed. What did she ask? She wanted to know if you were safe. Not where you were, just if you were safe. I told her yes, that I had that on good authority. She nodded and left without another word. I sat with that for a moment. Laura had asked if I was safe, not where her inheritance had gone. Perhaps there was still a glimmer of the daughter I raised in there somewhere. What happens next? I asked. Legally? Brandon will almost certainly try to contest the trust, though he doesn't have a case. He might try to get a court order compelling me to reveal your location, claiming you're mentally incapacitated and in danger. That won't work either. And, personally, Phil's voice softened. That's up to you, Eleanor. How long do you plan to stay away? What's your endgame here? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself every day since arriving in Cedar Key. I don't know yet, I admitted. Part of me wants to see if Laura will finally stand up to Brandon, see him for what he is. Another part wonders if I've already lost her for good. For what it's worth, Phil said carefully. I don't think she's as far gone as you fear. She's caught in the middle, trying to be loyal to both her husband and her mother. That's an impossible position. She put herself there, I reminded him. She chose him. Yes, but people can make different choices when they see things clearly. Give her time. This shock might be exactly what she needs to reevaluate her priorities. After hanging up, I walked down to the beach. The moon was nearly full, casting a silver path across the dark water. I thought about Laura as a little girl, how she would sleep with her window open on nights like this so the moonlight could fill her room. How she believed it would bring her good dreams. When had she stopped believing in simple magic like that? When had money and status become more important than the things that truly mattered? I didn't have answers, only hope that somewhere deep, inside, the daughter I raised still existed, and that she would find her way back to herself, with or without me. Life in Cedar Key developed its own rhythm. Mornings on the beach, afternoons reading or exploring the small town, evenings watching the sunset with a glass of wine. I began to recognize the locals, the woman who ran the coffee shop, the elderly couple who walked their terrier on the beach every morning at 7, the fisherman who would sell his fresh catch right off his boat at the small marina. I introduced myself as Ellie, a widow from up north, taking some time for myself after a difficult year. It wasn't far from the truth. No one asked too many questions, which suited me perfectly. 2 weeks after Phil's meeting with Laura and Brandon, I received another call from him. Brandon filed a petition with the court yesterday, he began without preamble. He's seeking a declaration that you were mentally incompetent when you established the trust, and he wants it nullified. On what grounds? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The usual, that you were suffering from depression after Frank's death, that you've shown increasingly erratic behavior, that your disappearance is proof of diminished capacity. Phil's tone made it clear what he thought of these arguments. He's included affidavits from 2 doctors who've never met you, making speculative diagnoses based on secondhand accounts of your behavior. Charming, And what are our chances? Of him succeeding? Almost zero. We have your medical records, sworn statements from your regular physician, and of course, my own documentation of your mental state when you established the trust. Plus, there's the fact that you had been planning this for months, which demonstrates clear, strategic thinking rather than impulsive behavior. Is Laura part of the petition? Phil hesitated. Her name is on it, yes, but I have it on good authority that she was reluctant to sign. Brandon apparently insisted. Good authority? I repeated. What does that mean? It means Laura came to see me privately yesterday, without Brandon's knowledge. I sat up straighter. What did she want? To talk. About you, about the trust, about what's been happening at home. Phil cleared his throat. Eleanor, I think you should call her. No, I said immediately. It's too soon. She'll try to convince me to come back, to undo what I've done. I don't think that's her priority anymore. She seemed different, more clear-eyed about Brandon than I've ever seen her. What did she say exactly? She asked me if I thought you hated her. When I assured her you didn't, she broke down crying. Said she'd been going through the last few years in her mind, seeing things she hadn't allowed herself to see before. How Brandon had gradually isolated her from her friends, how he'd pushed her to ask you for money time and again, how he'd dismissed her concerns when she thought it was too much. A spark of hope flickered in my chest. Go on. She said the private. School was Brandon's idea, not hers. That she'd been happy with the public school, but he insisted their children needed advantages he never had. She said the same about the house, the cars, the vacations, all Brandon pushing for more, leveraging the family's happiness as collateral. She enabled him, I pointed out, though my voice lacked conviction. Yes, she did, Phil agreed. And she acknowledges that. But Eleanor, she's seeing it now. Really seeing it. She asked me if the trust would ensure the children's college education, and when I confirmed it would, she seemed genuinely relieved. Did she ask where I am? No. She said she wouldn't put me in that position. But she did ask if I could pass along a message if I happened to be in contact with you. I hesitated, then asked, What message? She said to tell you she understands now, that she's sorry, and that she's trying to figure things out. She also said, Phil paused. She said to tell you that Brandon doesn't know about the children's college funds you set up years ago, that she never told him, because somehow she knew he'd find a way to use that money too. I closed my eyes, fighting back tears. Laura had kept that information from Brandon. Maybe there was hope after all. Will you call her? Phil pressed gently. Not yet, I said, though with less certainty than before. I need to think about this. Let me see how the court proceedings go first. After hanging up, I sat on the deck for a long time, watching a storm build on the horizon. Dark clouds gathered over the Gulf, stacking higher and higher until they formed a towering wall. Lightning flickered within the mass, too distant for thunder to reach me yet. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, much like the situation with Laura and Brandon. Was Laura truly seeing Brandon for what he was, or was this just another manipulation? People in desperate situations could say anything, promise anything. But then again, she'd kept the college funds secret from him. That had to mean something. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. I should go inside, batten down the hatches, as they said here on the coast. But something kept me rooted to the spot, watching nature's drama unfold. It matched the tumult in my heart. 3 days later, Phil called again. The court date is set for the trust hearing, 3 weeks from today. Will I need to appear? I asked, though I knew the answer. Eventually, yes. If only to demonstrate that you're alive and well and of sound mind. But not for the initial hearing. I can handle that. Brandon must be beside himself, I remarked. Actually, he's been surprisingly quiet. Laura told me he's been having long meetings with his real estate broker. Apparently, business isn't going as well as he's led everyone to believe. Meaning, he's overextended. The fancy car, the country club membership, the children's tuition, it was all built on future commissions that haven't materialized. Without the expected influx of your money, they're in trouble, I finished. Yes. Laura's started looking for full-time work. She's been part-time at her firm since the children were born, but now she's asking for more hours. I processed this information. Laura was taking practical steps to address their financial situation instead of just waiting for Brandon to fix everything. That was significant. There's something else, Phil added. Brandon's mother called me yesterday. Diane? I was genuinely surprised. Diane Reynolds had always been coolly polite to me at best, openly dismissive at worst. She thought Brandon had married beneath his station by choosing Laura, a view I found laughable given that Laura had a master's degree and Brandon had barely finished community college. Yes, she wanted to know if I could arrange a meeting with you. Whatever for. She wouldn't say, just that it was important and she wanted to speak with you privately. I told her I couldn't facilitate that, but if she had a message, I could potentially pass it along. And did she have a message? Only that things aren't what they seem, and that you should call her before making any final decisions. I snorted. Cryptic and manipulative. Sounds like Diane. I thought so too, but... Phil hesitated. There was something in her voice. Concern, maybe even fear. I don't think this was Brandon putting her up to it. Concern for me? Or for her precious son's financial future? I couldn't say. But it might be worth hearing what she has to say. At a distance, of course. I considered it. Diane had never been my ally, but she wasn't stupid either. If she had information that might affect my decisions going forward, perhaps I should at least listen. Give me her number, I said finally. I'll think about calling her. Later that afternoon, I walked into town for supplies. The small market had limited options, but enough for my simple needs. As I was selecting fruit, I overheard two women talking in the next aisle. Did you see the news about that investment? Company in Miami? The one that collapsed overnight? Reynolds Investments? Yes, terrible. All those people losing their retirement savings. I froze, my hand hovering over an apple. Reynolds Investments? It couldn't be a coincidence. They're saying, the owner, what's his name? Robert Reynolds, has fled the country, left his clients high and dry. Disgraceful. And the poor family, too. His wife on TV swearing she knew nothing about it. Robert Reynolds, Brandon's father, the man who had built a supposedly successful investment firm, from nothing, who lived in a mansion in Coral Gables, who had never thought Laura was good enough for his son. With shaking hands, I abandoned my shopping and hurried back to the cottage. Once there, I turned on the small television I rarely used and flipped through channels until I found a news station. There it was, the breaking story. Reynolds Investments collapses amid fraud allegations. Photos of Robert Reynolds flashed. On the screen, the silver-haired, tanned man I'd met at Laura's wedding, at holiday gatherings, always oozing confidence and just a hint of condescension. The reporter explained that Reynolds Investments had been operating a sophisticated Ponzi scheme for years. When market downturns had led to increased withdrawal requests, the whole house of cards had collapsed. Robert Reynolds had disappeared, presumably fled the country. Federal investigators were swarming the company's offices. Clients were left devastated, many losing their entire life savings. I sat down heavily on the couch. This explained Diane's call. This explained so much. Brandon had always boasted about eventually joining his father's firm, about the legacy he would inherit. What if that legacy was built on fraud? What if Brandon knew about it? What if he had been desperate for my money not just out of greed, but out of desperation? Trying to shore up his own finances before his father's scheme inevitably Collapsed? With trembling fingers, I dialed the number Phil had given me for Diane. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been sitting by the phone. "Eleanor?" she said, without any preliminaries. "Is that you?" "Yes, Diane. I just saw the news about—" "Robert," she exhaled sharply. "Then you understand why I needed to talk to you. There's so much more you don't know. About Brandon. About what he's been involved in." "Tell me," I said, my heart pounding. "Tell me everything." And as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across my cottage floor, Diane Reynolds began to reveal secrets that would forever change my understanding of Brandon, of Laura's marriage, and of the danger my daughter might be in, dangers far beyond mere financial ruin. "Brandon has always idolized his father," Diane began, her voice worn with emotion. "Even as a boy, he wanted nothing more than to be just like Robert. Successful, respected, wealthy. He didn't just want the lifestyle, he wanted the admiration that came with it." I listened intently, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed beginning to click into place. When Brandon was in college, if you can call those 2 years of partying college, Robert started bringing him into the business. Not in any official capacity, just showing him around, introducing him to clients, letting him sit in on meetings. Brandon soaked it all up like a sponge. "Did Brandon know?" I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind since I'd seen the news. "About the fraud?" Diane's bitter laugh crackled through the phone. "Not at first. Robert was careful. He compartmentalized everything. Most of his own employees had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. But eventually, Brandon found out about 3 years ago," Diane confirmed, her voice dropping. "And instead of being horrified, he was impressed, called it financial genius, said his father had created the perfect system." My stomach turned. "Are you saying Brandon became involved?" "Not directly with Reynolds Investments, no. Robert was smart enough to keep Brandon's name off anything official. But he did set Brandon up with his own little side operation, that real estate company. It was supposed to be legitimate, a way to diversify the family business. But it wasn't, I guessed. No," Diane sighed. "Brandon used it to move money for Robert. The expensive properties that never seemed to sell but somehow made money anyway? The investment properties with mysterious foreign buyers? All part of the scheme. Brandon's real estate business was essentially a money laundering operation." I closed my eyes, absorbing this gut punch. My son-in-law wasn't just financially irresponsible, he was potentially criminally liable, and Laura was married to him. My grandchildren called him father. "Why are you telling me this now, Diane?" I asked. "Why not years ago?" Another bitter laugh. "You think I knew?" "Robert kept me in the dark for decades. I thought we were simply fortunate, smart investments, good timing in the market. I had no idea he was stealing from people, ruining lives." Her voice broke. "I found out just 3 months ago. Confronted him. He swore he would make it right, find a way to pay everyone back. Then last week, I woke up to an empty bed and a note saying he was sorry." "And the authorities? Have they connected Brandon to any of this?" "Not yet," Diane said. "But they will. It's only a matter of time before they follow the money trail. When they do—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Does Laura know?" I asked, dreading the answer. "I don't think so. Brandon's good at compartmentalizing too. Keeps his business life separate from home." She paused. "Eleanor, that's why I've been trying to reach you. Laura needs to get out before this all comes crashing down. She needs to distance herself legally from Brandon's finances before the feds freeze everything." My mind raced. If Brandon was implicated in his father's scheme, everything he owned could be seized. The house, the cars, the bank accounts. Laura and the children could be left with nothing, not to mention the public humiliation and potential legal battles ahead. "Have you spoken to Laura about this?" I asked. I tried. She thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown over Robert leaving. Won't listen to a word against Brandon. Diane's voice hardened. That's why I need your help. She'll listen to you. I wouldn't be so sure about that, I said, thinking of our last conversation, of how I'd vanished from her life. We haven't exactly been on the best terms lately. You're still her mother, Diane insisted. And from what I hear, she's finally starting to see Brandon for what he is. This might be the push she needs. I promised Diane I would think about it, then hung up and immediately called Phil. After filling him in on Diane's revelations, I asked, how bad could this be for Laura legally? If she truly had no knowledge of Brandon's activities, she should be relatively protected, Phil said cautiously. But that's a big if in the eyes of investigators. They'll scrutinize everything: joint accounts, tax returns, property deeds, any document she's signed. And even if she's eventually cleared, the process could be financially devastating. What should we do? We need to get her advice from a criminal defense attorney who specializes in financial crimes, someone completely separate from Brandon. Will she accept help from me? I wondered aloud. After everything that's happened? I think she might, Phil said. She's been calling me every few days, asking if I've heard from you. There's been a shift in her attitude, Eleanor. She's scared, and not just about money. What do you mean? Phil hesitated. She mentioned that Brandon's behavior has become increasingly erratic. Staying out late, taking phone calls in private, emptying their joint accounts without explanation. She's worried about what he might do as the pressure builds. A chill ran through me. You think he could be dangerous? I think a desperate man, with potential criminal liability hanging over his head, isn't the most predictable person, Phil said carefully. It might be time to end your sabbatical, Eleanor. Laura needs you. By morning, I had made my decision. I packed my few belongings, left a thank you note and cash for Marcus, and began the journey back. Not directly home. That would be reckless until I knew exactly what was happening with Brandon and the federal investigation, but to a hotel in my home city, close enough to meet with Laura in person. I called Phil from the road. I'm coming back. Can you arrange a meeting with Laura? Neutral location, just the two of us. I'll try, he promised. What about Brandon? Under no circumstances is he to know I'm back or that Laura is meeting with me. Make that absolutely clear to her. It took 2 days to make the journey back. A deliberate zigzag route designed to be difficult to trace. By the time I checked into the Baymont Inn on the outskirts of town, Phil had confirmed the meeting. Laura would meet me at his office the following afternoon. Brandon believed she would be meeting with a real estate client. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with all that had happened, all that was still to come. How would Laura react when she saw me? Would she be angry, relieved, or both? Would she believe what I had to tell her about Brandon's involvement in his father's crimes? And even if she did, would she have the strength to do what needed to be done? The next day, I arrived at Phil's office through the private rear entrance as arranged. His assistant showed me to a small conference room and offered me coffee, which I accepted gratefully. 20 minutes later, the door opened, and there she was. Laura looked thinner than when I'd last seen her, dark circles under her eyes, her usually immaculate hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She froze in the doorway, staring at me as if seeing a ghost. "Mom?" she whispered. I stood, unsure of the protocol for greeting your adult daughter after vanishing from her life. "Hello, Laura." For a long moment, we just looked at each other. Then she rushed forward, throwing her arms around me with such force that I nearly lost my balance. "You're okay," she said against my shoulder, her voice breaking. "You're really okay." I held her tightly, feeling her shoulders shake with silent sobs. "I'm okay," I confirmed softly. "I'm right here." Eventually, we separated and sat down across from each other at the conference table. Laura wiped her eyes with a tissue Phil had thoughtfully left on the table. I thought, she began, then stopped, composing herself. I was so worried. Even when Phil said you were safe, I couldn't help thinking the worst. I'm sorry for that, I said sincerely. I never meant to make you worry about my safety. I just needed space. Time to think. Laura nodded slowly. Because of what Brandon and I did. The house listing. The pressure about money. She looked down at her hands. I'm so ashamed, Mom. I let myself be convinced that what we were doing was for your own good, but it wasn't. It was selfish, controlling, disrespectful. Hearing her acknowledge this lifted a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Yes, it was all those things. But that's not why I'm here now, Laura. Something more urgent has come up. Something you need to know about Brandon. Her expression changed, wariness replacing relief. What about him? Gently but firmly, I laid out everything Diane had told me about Robert's Ponzi scheme and Brandon's involvement through his real estate business. I explained the likelihood of a federal investigation, the potential seizure of assets, the legal jeopardy she and the children might face if she didn't act quickly. Laura's face went from skeptical to shocked to ashen as I spoke. When I finished, she sat in stunned silence for several moments. I knew things weren't right, she finally said, her voice barely audible. The mood swings, the secrecy about money, the way he'd panic if I asked too many questions about the business. She looked up at me, her eyes haunted. 2 nights ago, I found him in his home office at 3 a.m., shredding documents. When I asked what he was doing, he snapped at me to mind my own business, said some things were better not known. Laura, I said gently, you need to protect yourself and the children. Legally and financially, yes, but also perhaps physically. If Brandon is feeling trapped, he wouldn't hurt us, she said automatically, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Maybe not intentionally, I conceded, but people in desperate situations can act unpredictably. Is there somewhere you and the children could stay, just temporarily, until we figure this out? She shook her head. He watches us like a hawk lately, wants to know where we are every minute. He even installed one of those doorbell cameras that sends alerts to his phone whenever someone comes or goes. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. That's not normal, Laura. That's controlling behavior. I know, she whispered, and I could see she truly did. I've been blind for so long, Mom. Or maybe not blind, just unwilling to see. It happens, I said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. The important thing is that you're seeing clearly now, and we're going to figure this out together. Phil joined us then, bringing a criminal defense attorney he trusted, Karen, Ellis, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with a reputation for helping spouses extricate themselves from their partner's financial crimes. Karen listened to Laura's situation, asked pointed questions about her knowledge of Brandon's business, dealings, and then outlined a strategy. First, we document everything. Every conversation, every suspicious behavior, every financial transaction you can remember that seemed off. Second, we quietly gather essential documents. Birth certificates, social security cards, children's passports if they have them. Third, we establish separate finances, new accounts at different banks, credit cards in your name only. And fourth, and this is crucial, we meet with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Laura's head snapped up. Turn him in, you mean? Karen's expression was sympathetic but firm. We establish your cooperation and lack of knowledge early, before they come to you. Because they will come to you, Mrs. Reynolds. It's only a matter of time. And the children? Laura asked, her voice small. What happens to them when their father goes to prison? Karen didn't sugarcoat it. It will be difficult. There's no way around that. But children are resilient, especially when they have a strong support system. She glanced at me. Having a grandmother who loves them will make a world of difference. Laura looked at me, a question in her eyes. "You'll be there? Even after everything?" "I'll be there," I promised. "For all of you." The plan was set in motion. That very day, Laura would begin gathering documents, keeping a detailed log of Brandon's behavior, and preparing for what Karen called financial disentanglement. They would meet again in 2 days to review her findings and strategize the approach to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I checked into a different hotel under my maiden name, not willing to risk returning to my house just yet. That night, Laura called me from her car during her lunch break at work. "He's emptying the house," she said without preamble. "I came home to grab some papers from my desk, and there were men there loading artwork into a van. Brandon said he was having it appraised, but Mom, they were loading everything." My heart raced. "What kind of van? Did it have a company name?" "Unmarked." And when I asked for a receipt or documentation, Brandon got angry. Said I was being paranoid, that it was routine. But I've never seen these men before, and some of the pieces they were taking were wedding gifts from his father. Family heirlooms, supposedly. "He's liquidating assets," I said grimly. "Getting ready to run." "That's what I thought too." I pretended to believe him. "But Mom, I'm scared. If he's planning to flee, what happens when he realizes I'm not going with him? What happens when the money from the appraisals comes in and I try to keep it from disappearing?" "You can't go back there," I said firmly. "Not tonight. Tell him you're working late, then come to me. We'll figure out how to get the children safely tomorrow. He'll know something's wrong if I don't come home." "Better that than walking into a potentially volatile situation alone," I insisted. "Laura, please. This isn't about being dramatic or overreacting. This is about recognizing the signs of a desperate person about to do desperate things." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she finally said. "I'll tell him I'm meeting clients for dinner, then working on the proposal afterward. It's believable. I've done it before. Text me when you're on your way. I'll text you the hotel address." After we hung up, I immediately called Phil and updated him. He agreed with my assessment. Brandon was likely preparing to flee, probably overseas to join his father. Then I called Karen Ellis and explained the new development. "This accelerates our timeline," she said briskly. "If he's moving assets, we need to act immediately. Can you get Laura to my office tonight? I'd like to call my contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office right away." It was all happening so fast. Just hours ago, I'd been reunited with my daughter. Now we were preparing to potentially send her husband to prison. But the alternative, letting Brandon disappear with whatever assets he could liquidate, leaving Laura and the children to face the legal and financial fallout alone, was unthinkable. At 30 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Laura. "On my way." I texted her the hotel address and waited anxiously. 20 minutes passed, then 30. I called her cell, but it went straight to voicemail. By 7:15 p.m., my concern had shifted to alarm. I called Phil. "Laura's not answering her phone. She should have been here by now." "Maybe traffic," he suggested. But I could hear the worry in his voice too. "I'm going to drive by their house," I decided, "just to see if her car is there." "Eleanor, that's not safe. If Brandon's volatile—" "I'll stay in the car," I promised. "Just a drive-by, but I need to know she's okay." I took a taxi to a shopping center near Laura's neighborhood, then called a rideshare to take me past their house. The driver, a chatty young man named Khalil, made small talk as we approached the upscale subdivision where Laura and Brandon lived. "Nice neighborhood," he commented as we turned onto their street. "You visiting family?" "Something like that," I murmured, scanning the houses until we reached number 457. "Could you slow down a bit?" He obliged, and I peered out the window at the large Tudor-style home. Laura's car was in the driveway. So was Brandon's. The unmarked van Laura had mentioned was gone, but a sleek black SUV I didn't recognize sat at the curb. "Everything okay?" Khalil asked, noticing my intense focus. "I'm not sure," I admitted. My daughter was supposed to meet me, but she's not answering her phone. That's her house with the blue door? Khalil slowed even more, both of us now staring at the house. The downstairs lights were on, but the curtains were drawn. Nothing seemed obviously amiss from the outside. Want me to drive around the block? He offered. Give you another look? Yes, please. As we circled back, I noticed movement at one of the upstairs windows, a curtain twitching, then falling back into place. Someone was watching the street. One more pass, I requested, an idea. Forming. And this time, could you stop for just a moment? I want to check something on my phone. Khalil nodded, pulling over about 4 houses down from Laura's. I pretended to check my phone while actually watching the house. Sure enough, the front door opened slightly, then closed again quickly. I think someone's home but not answering the door, I murmured, more to myself than to Khalil. Family drama? He asked sympathetically. You could say that. I made a decision. Would you mind waiting while I make a quick call? I'll pay for your time. No problem, he said easily, turning down the radio. I called Karen Ellis, updating her on the situation. I believe Laura is in the house, but she's not responding to calls or texts. And someone is watching the street. Karen's response was immediate and unequivocal. I'm calling the police for a welfare check. Given the circumstances and what we know about Brandon's potential criminal activities, we have reason for concern. As I ended the call with Karen, my phone buzzed with a text. Unknown number. Mom, it's me. Using Thomas's iPad. Brandon took my phone. Says we're going on a family trip tonight. Packing now. He's acting strange. Scary. Don't call police yet. He's watching me constantly. We'll try to delay. Can you get help? My blood ran cold. Brandon was planning to take Laura and the children tonight. Probably out of the country. Probably on false documents he'd already arranged through his shady business connections. I showed the text to Khalil. My son-in-law is trying to kidnap my daughter and grandchildren. We need to call the police right now. To his credit, Khalil didn't hesitate or question me. He simply pulled out his phone and dialed 911, handing it to me when the dispatcher answered. This is an emergency, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. My daughter and grandchildren are being held against their will at 457 Maple Road. My son-in-law is preparing to take them out of the country tonight. He's involved in a financial crimes investigation and is fleeing prosecution. My daughter just texted me for help. As I spoke, I saw the black SUV's headlights come on. It was parked with the front facing away from the house, ready for a quick departure. Ma'am, officers are being dispatched now, the dispatcher assured me. Please stay on the line and maintain your distance from the residents. They're leaving, I said urgently, watching as the garage door began to open. Right now, they're leaving right now. And as police sirens wailed in the distance, I watched Brandon's escape plan begin to unravel, setting in motion a confrontation that would permanently alter all our lives. Don't move! Police are coming, I told Khalil, who had already put the car in gear, anticipating my request before I'd even made it. What are you thinking? He asked, eyes darting between me and the house. Get closer, but slowly. I want him to see me. Khalil eased the car forward, moving at a crawl toward Laura's house. The garage door was fully open now, revealing Brandon loading suitcases into his Mercedes SUV. Laura stood nearby, holding 9-year-old Emily's hand while Thomas, at 11, helped his father with a large duffel bag. Stop here, I instructed when we were directly across from the driveway. Brandon hadn't noticed us yet, too focused on his frantic packing, but Laura had. Our eyes met through the car window, and I saw a flash of hope cross her face, quickly masked when Brandon turned in her direction. I rolled down my window and called out, Going somewhere, Brandon? His head snapped up, eyes widening as he registered my presence. For a moment, he seemed frozen in disbelief, unable to process that the mother-in-law he'd been trying to fleece for months, the one who had disappeared, rather than comply, was now sitting in a car outside his house just as he was attempting to flee the country. "Eleanor," he finally managed, his voice a mix of shock and fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" "I think the better question is, what are you doing?" I responded calmly, opening the car door and stepping out despite Khalil's murmured warning. "Taking the family on a trip without passports? Or did you get those forged too?" Brandon's face paled, then flushed with anger. He strode toward me, stopping at the edge of the driveway. "Get back in that car and leave. This is none of your business." "Mom?" Laura called, her voice strained but determined. "Don't go." Brandon wheeled around. "Shut up, Laura. Get the kids in the car. Now!" But Laura stood her ground, pulling Emily closer to her side. "No, we're not going anywhere with you." The wail of sirens grew louder, now just a few blocks away. Brandon's eyes darted nervously toward the sound, then back to Laura, then to me. I could almost see the calculations running through his mind. How much time he had, whether he could still salvage his escape plan, whether it was worth trying to force Laura and the children to come with him. "Police," I said clearly, meeting his gaze. "They know everything, Brandon. About your father's Ponzi scheme, about your real estate business laundering money, about you trying to take Laura and the children out of the country against their will." "You bitch," he snarled, taking a step toward me. "You've ruined everything." Khalil was out of the car now, too, positioning himself slightly in front of me. "Back off, man," he warned. "Think about what you're doing." Brandon seemed about to lunge at us when Thomas's voice cut through the tension. "Dad? What's happening?" The boy stood in the garage, confused and frightened. Brandon turned to him, his expression softening for a moment. "Nothing, buddy. Get in the car. We're going on an adventure, remember?" "Thomas, come here," Laura called firmly. "Come stand with me and Emily." The boy hesitated, looking between his parents. Something in Laura's voice must have reached him because he slowly backed away from the SUV and moved toward his mother and sister. Brandon's face contorted with rage. "Fine," he spat. "Stay. Stay here and watch everything collapse. When they come to seize the house, the cars, every last thing we own, don't come crying to me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys, then yanked open the driver's side door of the SUV. "I'm leaving. Last chance to come with me, Laura." "No," she said simply. "It's over, Brandon." For a heartbeat, something like genuine grief flashed across his face. Then it hardened into cold fury. "Your loss," he muttered, climbing into the SUV and starting the engine. The first police car rounded the corner, lights flashing, just as Brandon began backing out of the garage. Another police car appeared from the opposite direction, effectively boxing him in. "Police! Turn off the vehicle!" An officer shouted through a loudspeaker. Brandon hesitated for only a second before gunning the engine, swerving sharply to mount the curb in an attempt to get around the police car blocking the driveway. The SUV lurched forward, tires spinning. On the manicured lawn. "Get down!" I shouted to Laura and the children, while Khalil pulled me back toward his car. The SUV made it halfway across the lawn before the second police car maneuvered to cut him off. Brandon swerved again, narrowly missing a tree, then suddenly braked hard as a third police car appeared, blocking his path completely. Within seconds, officers surrounded the vehicle, weapons drawn, ordering Brandon to shut off the engine and show his hands. For one terrible moment, I thought he might try to ram through the blockade, but then the SUV's engine died, and his hands appeared, gripping the steering wheel. As officers approached the vehicle, shouting instructions, I ran to Laura and the children. They were huddled together at the edge of the driveway, Emily sobbing, into her mother's side, Thomas standing rigid with shock. "Are you all right?" I asked, gathering them into my arms. Laura nodded mutely, tears streaming down her face as she watched the police handcuff Brandon and lead him to a patrol car. The children clung to us, frightened and confused. "Grandma, why are they taking Dad?" Thomas asked, his voice small. "How do you explain to a child that his father is involved in financial crimes? That he was about to kidnap them and flee the country? That everything they thought they knew about their family life was built on lies?" "Your dad made some mistakes," I said carefully. "The police need to talk to him about them." "Are we in trouble too?" Emily whispered. "No, sweetheart," Laura assured her, finding her voice at last. "We're not in trouble, but we need to be very honest with the police and tell them exactly what happened tonight." A female officer approached us, her expression professional but kind. "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm Officer Ramirez. We need to ask you some questions. Is there somewhere we can talk while my colleagues secure the scene?" Laura glanced at the house, then shook her head. "I don't want to go back in there right now." "We can talk at my hotel," I suggested. "It's not far from here." "That works," Officer Ramirez agreed. "We'll need statements from all of you, including the children. But we can keep it as gentle as possible," she added, noticing my concerned glance at Thomas and Emily. Laura nodded gratefully. "Thank you." As we prepared to leave, I remembered Khalil, who was standing a respectful distance away, speaking with another officer. I walked over to him. "I can't thank you enough," I said sincerely. "You went above and beyond for a complete stranger tonight." He shrugged, offering a small smile. "My sister was in an abusive relationship once. I know how these things can go down. Just glad everyone's safe." I insisted on paying him generously for his time and giving him a 5-star rating in the app. It seemed a paltry acknowledgement for what he'd done, but he accepted it with grace before driving away. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements, phone calls to Phil and Karen Ellis, and attempts to comfort Thomas and Emily, who vacillated between shock, confusion, and exhaustion. By midnight, we were all installed in my hotel suite, the children finally asleep in the bedroom while Laura and I sat in the living area, talking in low voices. "I should have seen it," Laura said, staring into her cup of cold tea. "All the signs were there. The secretive phone calls, the unexplained cash, the way he'd get defensive whenever I asked questions about the business." "We see what we want to see," I said gently, "especially when it comes to those we love." She looked up, at me, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Is that what you did with me? Saw what you wanted to see?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I was awful to you, Mom. I let Brandon pressure you about money. I stood by while he listed your house without permission. I didn't stand up for you when you needed me to." Her voice broke. "I was a terrible daughter." "No," I said firmly, reaching for her hand. "You were a wife caught between loyalty to your husband and your mother. It's an impossible position. And as for seeing what I wanted to see," I sighed. "Yes, I suppose I did that too. I saw the little girl I raised, not the woman who was becoming increasingly influenced by her husband's values." "When did it change?" she asked. "When did I start caring more about money and status than about what was right?" I considered the question carefully. "I think it happened gradually. Brandon has always been focused on appearances, on keeping up with a certain lifestyle. Over time, his priorities became yours. It happens in marriages. You absorb each other's values, sometimes without even realizing it." Laura nodded, wiping away fresh tears. "The worst part is, I really believed we needed all of it. The big house, the private schools, the luxury cars. I convinced myself it was for the children's benefit, that we were giving them advantages. But really, we were just teaching them that stuff matters more than people. It's not too late to teach them differently," I pointed out. "Children are remarkably adaptable, and they have you to guide them. And you," she said, meeting my eyes. "If you're willing to stay in our lives, that is. Even after everything." "I'm not going anywhere," I promised. except perhaps back to my own house once things settled down. A small smile flickered across her face. I'd like that. The kids would too. We fell silent, both lost in our thoughts. The events of the evening seemed surreal. Brandon's arrest, the police questioning, the realization that life as Laura and the children knew it had fundamentally changed. There would be hard days ahead, financial uncertainty, legal proceedings, the social fallout as Brandon's involvement in his father's crimes became public knowledge. But beneath the chaos and pain, I felt a glimmer of hope. Laura was seeing clearly now, perhaps for the first time in years, and our relationship, damaged, as it had been, was beginning to heal. What happens now? Laura asked softly, as if reading my thoughts. Now we take it one day at a time, I said. Tomorrow, we'll meet with Karen again. Start the process of legally protecting you and the children from Brandon's actions. We'll figure out practical matters, where you'll stay, what to tell the kids' schools, how to handle finances in the short term. And in the long term? I squeezed her hand. In the long term, you rebuild. You figure out what kind of life you want, what kind of mother you want to be, what values you want to instill in Thomas and Emily. And you give yourself grace, because none of this is going to be easy. She nodded, some of the tension leaving, her shoulders. You know what's strange. There's a part of me that feels relieved, like I can finally stop pretending, stop worrying about appearances and keeping up with Brandon's expectations. That doesn't sound strange at all, I assured her. Sometimes the hardest prisons are the ones we build ourselves. The following morning brought new challenges. Brandon had been formally charged with money laundering, wire fraud, and attempted kidnapping. His bail was set at $1 million a sum. He might have been able to meet a week ago, but with his accounts frozen and assets being scrutinized, he remained in custody. Laura, the children, and I relocated to a rental house Phil had arranged. A modest 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. Paid for 3 months in advance from my personal funds. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, safe, and far enough from their old home to provide some emotional distance. Karen Ellis became our lifeline, guiding Laura through the complex legal waters of separating herself from Brandon's crimes while protecting what assets she could for the children's future. The trust I had established for Thomas and Emily remained untouched, safely beyond the reach of both federal investigators and Brandon's creditors. We decided to tell the children a version of the truth appropriate for their ages. Dad had made some bad choices in his business and had to answer for them. He had tried to take them away without permission, which was why the police had stopped him. They would be living with Mom for now, and Grandma would be staying with them to help out. Thomas, serious and thoughtful like his grandfather Frank, asked pointed questions that revealed he understood more than we'd initially thought. Dad was stealing money, wasn't he? That's why we had to leave the house. Laura confirmed this gently, emphasizing that what Brandon had done was his responsibility alone, not theirs. Emily, more emotional and still attached to her father despite his flaws, alternated between tears and anger. But when will we see Dad again? It's not fair. I miss our house and my room and my friends. These moments were the hardest, watching the children grapple with loss and confusion, knowing there were no easy answers to give them. A week after Brandon's arrest, I finally returned to my own home. Phil had maintained it in my absence, ensuring that utilities remained on and basic maintenance was performed. Walking through the front door after months away felt surreal. Everything exactly as I'd left it, yet somehow changed, as if the house had existed in a parallel universe while I was gone. I moved slowly from room to room, reacquainting myself with my possessions, my spaces, my life before everything had imploded. In the kitchen, I ran my fingers over the countertops Frank and I had selected together 20 years ago. In the living room, I sat in my favorite chair, looking out at the garden now overgrown but still beautiful in its wildness. This house held memories of a lifetime. Frank bringing Laura home as a newborn, Laura taking her first steps across this very living room floor, family dinners and holiday celebrations and quiet evenings reading by the fire. It was more than just a structure. It was the physical manifestation of our family's history. And now, it would begin a new chapter. Laura and the children would be moving in with me once the rental period ended. It made the most financial sense. Laura's assets were frozen pending investigation, and the children needed stability. But beyond practicality, it felt right. A chance to rebuild our family bonds in a space filled with love and memories. That afternoon, I called a landscaper to restore the garden, a cleaning service to refresh the house, and a contractor to convert the rarely used formal dining room into a homework and play space for the children. Small changes to make room for new beginnings. As I stood on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, my phone buzzed with a text from Laura. "Just told the kids about moving to your house. Emily wants to know if she can paint her room purple. Thomas is worried about changing schools again." I smiled, typing back, "Purple is perfect, and the school in my neighborhood is excellent. I already checked. We'll make this work." 3 dots appeared as Laura typed her response. "I know we will. Thank you, Mom. For everything. For not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to." Tears pricked my eyes as I read her words. "Never," I replied. "Not then. Not now. Not ever." Later that evening, as I prepared for my first night back in my own bed, I took out the photo I'd carried with me throughout my absence, Frank and me on our 40th anniversary, both of us laughing at some forgotten joke. I placed it on the nightstand where it had always been. "Well, Frank," I said to the empty room, "it didn't go quite how I planned, but I think we're going to be okay now." And for the first time in months, I truly believed it. The road ahead would be challenging. Brandon's trial, the financial untangling, helping the children process the upheaval in their young lives. But we would face it together, as a family should. When I'd emptied my accounts and vanished all those months ago, I'd been acting out of self-preservation. Yes, but also out of a desperate hope that somehow the shock of my disappearance might wake Laura up to what was happening in her life. It had been a gamble, a last resort when all other attempts at communication had failed. Never in my wildest dreams could I have imagined how it would all unfold. The revelations about Brandon's criminal activities, the narrowly averted kidnapping, the painful but necessary rebuilding that now lay ahead of us. As I drifted toward sleep in the quiet comfort of my own home, I thought about the irony of it all. Brandon had demanded my life savings, intending to use it to escape the consequences of his actions. Instead, his greed had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately saved not just my money, but something far more precious: my relationship with my daughter and grandchildren. Sometimes the most difficult choices lead us exactly where we need to be, even when the path is nothing like what we imagined. And sometimes, what looks like an ending is really just the beginning of something new, something stronger, wiser, and more genuine than what came before. The first month after Brandon's arrest was a whirlwind of legal consultations, financial assessments, and emotional adjustments. Laura met with federal prosecutors 3 times, providing everything she knew about Brandon's business dealings, which turned out to be less than they'd initially feared. She had genuinely been kept in the dark about the money laundering aspects of his real estate business, a fact that worked in her favor legally, if not emotionally. "They showed me documents with my signature on them," Laura told me one evening, her voice hollow as we sat on my back porch after the children had gone to bed. "Paperwork for shell companies I didn't even know existed. Brandon had me sign things. For years, always saying they were just routine business matters, that I shouldn't worry my pretty little head about the details. It wasn't your fault," I said, though we both knew these reassurances couldn't erase the humiliation she felt. I should have read what I was signing. I should have asked questions. She stared into her teacup, as if searching for answers in the amber liquid. I have 2 degrees, Mom. I'm not stupid. I was just willfully blind. Brandon was very good at what he did, I pointed out. He kept Diane in the dark for decades. Professional investigators didn't catch on for years. Don't be so hard on yourself. Laura nodded, but I could tell my words weren't fully penetrating the wall of self-recrimination she'd built around herself. That would take time, and probably therapy, which she had wisely begun the week after moving into the rental house. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own readjustment. After months of solitude in Cedar Key, having a household full of people, particularly children, required an adaptation period. I loved having them with me, but I'd grown accustomed to quiet mornings with only the sound of gulls outside my window, to eating when I felt hungry rather than on a family schedule, to having my space exactly as I left it. Now there were backpacks. By the door, children's shoes scattered in the hallway, the constant hum of activity that comes with family life. Beautiful chaos, Frank would have called it. And he would have been right. The children were adjusting remarkably well, all things considered. Thomas, always the more reserved of the two, had thrown himself into exploring the neighborhood, making detailed maps of walking routes and cataloging interesting trees and plants he discovered. It was his way of creating order from chaos, I suspected, something he could control when so much else in his life had been upended. Emily had transformed my rarely used sewing room into her art studio, covering the walls with colorful drawings and paintings. Many featured our family, Laura, Thomas, herself, and me, standing together in front of various backgrounds: my house, a beach, a rainbow. Brandon was noticeably absent from these family portraits, though occasionally she'd draw him alone, usually behind what looked like a fence or in a car driving away. Her therapist said this was her way of processing what had happened, placing Brandon outside the new family unit she was forming. One evening, about 6 weeks after moving in with me, Laura received a phone call that changed everything once again. It was Karen Ellis. "Brandon wants to make a deal," Laura told me after hanging up, her expression a mix of relief and trepidation. "He's going to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testifying against his father and several other high-level players in the Ponzi scheme." "What does that mean for him?" "And for you?" I asked. "For him?" "Still prison time, but maybe 5 to 7 years instead of 15 to 20. For us," she took a deep breath, "it means he's waiving any claim to the house, the cars, any assets that haven't been seized. He's also agreeing to an uncontested divorce and willing to forfeit parental rights." I raised my eyebrows in surprise. "He's giving up the children?" "Completely?" Laura nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Karen says it's a calculated move. By completely separating himself from us legally, he's making it harder for prosecutors to come after anything I might rebuild for the kids. It's actually the most selfless thing he's ever done." We sat with that paradox for a moment. Brandon, who had been prepared to kidnap his children and flee the country, now willing to legally sever ties with them to protect their future. People were complicated, even those who had caused so much harm. "How do you feel about it?" I asked carefully. Laura wiped her eyes. "Relieved, mostly. The divorce and custody battles could have dragged on for years. This way, we can move forward. Start rebuilding, but also," she hesitated. "Sad," I finished for her. "It's okay to feel sad, Laura. Despite everything, he's the father of your children, the man you once loved enough to marry." She nodded, letting the tears fall freely now. Part of me keeps wondering if there was something I could have done differently, if I'd been more attentive to the business, or if I'd pushed back harder against the lifestyle Brandon insisted we needed. "You can't rewrite the past," I said gently. "You can only learn from it and move forward." "That's what my therapist keeps telling me," she said with a weak smile. "It's harder than it sounds. Most worthwhile things are. The next hurdle was telling the children. We decided to approach it as a family, with both Laura and me present, after consulting with the children's therapist for guidance. We gathered in the living room after dinner, the television off, phones put away, everyone's full attention on the conversation. Laura kept it simple and age-appropriate. Dad has decided to accept responsibility for the mistakes he made, she explained. He's going to tell the police everything he knows about Grandpa Robert's business problems, and in exchange his punishment won't be as severe. How long will he be in jail? Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. At 11, he understood more than we sometimes gave him credit for. Several years, Laura answered honestly, but less time than if he hadn't cooperated. Emily, curled up next to me on the sofa, asked the question I'd been dreading. But we'll still get to visit him, right? Once a month like we've been doing? Laura took a deep breath, glancing at me briefly before focusing on her daughter. Dad has made another decision, sweetheart. He thinks it would be better for everyone if he steps back from being part of our family for now. Emily's brow furrowed. What does that mean? It means we won't be visiting him anymore. And legally, he won't be your dad in the same way. He'll always be your biological father, but he's giving up something called parental rights. He doesn't want to be our dad anymore? Emily's voice cracked, her 9-year-old mind cutting straight to what felt like rejection. Oh, honey. Laura moved to sit on Emily's other side, sandwiching the girl between us. It's not that he doesn't want to be. It's that he knows he can't be, not the way you deserve, not for a long time. And he doesn't want you to have to wait for him, or to be tied to his legal problems. Thomas, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. He's protecting us, he said with surprising insight. If he's not legally our dad anymore, then the people who are mad at him can't take anything from us, right? Laura nodded, impressed by her son's perception. That's part of it, yes. Like when he put me in someone else's boat during the sailing race last summer, Thomas continued, working through the concept. My boat was leaking, and if I'd stayed in it, I would have sunk with it. So he made me switch, even though it meant I couldn't finish the race. That's a good analogy, I said, touched by the way Thomas was finding a positive frame for his father's actions, a memory that painted Brandon in a caring light. Emily wasn't as easily consoled. But I don't want a different dad, she said, tears streaming down her face. I want my dad, even if he made mistakes. Laura pulled her daughter into a tight hug. I know, baby, I know. And you don't have to have a different dad. You don't need to have any dad at all if you don't want. It's just going to be us for a while. You, me, Thomas, and Grandma, and that's enough. We're enough. Later that night, after the children had finally gone to bed, Emily exhausted from crying, Thomas quiet and contemplative, Laura and I sat in the kitchen, picking at the remains of a chocolate cake I'd baked earlier in the day. That was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had, Laura admitted, pushing cake crumbs around her plate. You handled it beautifully, I told her. Honest but gentle. That's all you can do. You know what scares me the most? She said, looking up at me. The thought of doing this alone, raising them by myself. You're not alone, I reminded her. I'm here. I know, and I'm beyond grateful. But you won't always be, Mom. And even while you are, it's not the same as having a partner, someone to share the decisions, the worries, the middle-of-the-night fevers. I understood what she meant. After Frank died, I'd felt that absence keenly. The loss of my other half. The person who balanced my strengths and weaknesses with his own. It won't always feel this overwhelming, I assured her. You'll find your rhythm as a single parent. And someday when you're ready, you might find someone else to share your life with. Laura's laugh was bitter. After this disaster? I think I've lost my taste for relationships. Besides, Who would want to take on a divorced mother of two whose ex-husband is in federal prison for financial crimes? Someone who sees your strength, your resilience, your capacity to love, I said simply. Someone worthy of you. She smiled faintly, unconvinced but unwilling to argue the point. Maybe, but that's a concern for another day. Right now, I need to focus on the kids, on making a home for them, on figuring out what comes next. What came next was a series of practical challenges. With Brandon's plea deal in place, Laura was able to access some of their unfrozen assets, though much had been seized to help repay victims of the Ponzi scheme. The divorce proceeded quickly, finalized just 3 months after Brandon's arrest. The court approved his voluntary termination of parental rights, a decision that would have long-lasting implications for all of them. Through it all, we settled into a new normal. Laura found a job at a small marketing firm, a step down from her previous position, but one that offered flexible hours and understanding bosses who didn't flinch when she mentioned her ex-husband's legal troubles. The children enrolled in the local schools, gradually making new friends and adjusting to lives very different from the privileged existence they'd known before. And I found myself in a role I hadn't anticipated at this stage of life, a sort of co-parent, deeply involved in the day-to-day raising of my grandchildren. I drove them to school when Laura had early meetings, attended Thomas's science fair, sat through Emily's dance recitals, helped with homework, and cooked family dinners. It wasn't how I'd imagined spending my late 60s, but there was an unexpected joy in it, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Frank's death. 6 months into our new arrangement, I noticed Laura growing restless. Not unhappy exactly, but like she was outgrowing the emergency measures we'd put in place after Brandon's arrest. "I've been thinking," she said one Saturday morning as we worked together in the garden, Emily helping by digging holes wherever. She pleased while Thomas meticulously labeled the new plants with popsicle sticks. Maybe it's time we look for our own place. I sat back on my heels, brushing soil from my gardening gloves. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need, you know that." "I do," she assured me. "And living with you has been a blessing, truly. I don't know how we would have managed otherwise, but I think it might be good for the kids, for all of us, to establish our own home. Not anything grand, just a small place nearby. Something that feels like ours." I nodded, understanding her need for independence, even as I felt a pang at the thought of the house emptying out again. "I think that's wise. The children need to feel settled, to know that life isn't just one temporary arrangement after another." "We'll be close," she promised, reading the unspoken worry in my eyes. "Close enough that the kids can walk or bike over whenever they want. Close enough for family dinner every Sunday." "Every Sunday and Wednesday," I countered with a smile. "Deal," she laughed, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Thank you, Mom, for everything. I don't know if I've said that enough." "You don't need to say it at all," I assured her. "That's what family does. We show up for each other." Later that day, I found myself alone on the back porch, watching the sunset and thinking about all that had transpired since the day Brandon first cornered me in my kitchen, demanding access to my finances. In some ways, it felt like a lifetime ago. In others, like it had just happened yesterday. I thought about my desperate decision to empty my accounts and vanish rather than be bullied into surrendering my financial independence. At the time, it had felt like my only option, a last-ditch effort to maintain control over my own life. I couldn't have known then how that choice would set in motion a series of events that would ultimately save not just my savings, but my daughter and grandchildren as well. If I hadn't disappeared, would Laura have ever seen Brandon for who he truly was? Would she have had the opportunity to reclaim her independence, her voice, her confidence? Would the children have learned the valuable lessons they were absorbing now, about resilience, about honesty, about what truly constitutes a rich life? There was no way to know for certain, but as I watched Thomas help Emily build a fairy house in the corner of the garden, their heads bent together in concentration, Laura snapping photos and calling out suggestions, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for where we had landed, despite, or perhaps because of, the difficult journey that had brought us here. The doorbell rang, interrupting my reflections. Laura looked up from the garden, a question in her eyes. "I'll get it," I called, making my way through the house. When I opened the front door, I found Diane Reynolds standing on my porch, looking thinner and older than when I'd last seen her at Laura's wedding 8 years earlier. Her carefully maintained blonde hair was now streaked with gray, her designer clothes replaced by simple slacks and a cardigan. Her confident posture diminished by the weight of recent events. "Eleanor," she said, her voice lacking its usual imperious tone. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to thank you in person for everything you've done for Laura and the children." For a moment, I simply stared at her, too surprised to respond. This was not the Diane I knew, the woman who had once looked down her nose at Laura for not coming from the right family, who had treated me with barely concealed disdain at every family gathering. "Would you like to come in?" I finally managed, stepping aside to open the door wider. Diane hesitated, glancing past me into the house. "I don't want to impose, and I'm not sure Laura would want to see me." "Why don't we let her decide that for herself?" I suggested, gesturing again for her to enter. As Diane stepped tentatively into my home, I had a sudden flash of insight. The journey we'd been on, Laura, the children, and I, wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There would be more challenges. Ahead, more adjustments, more moments that tested our resilience and resolve. But we were facing them together now, eyes open, hearts connected. And perhaps our circle was about to widen in unexpected ways, bringing healing not just to our immediate family, but to those whose lives had been shattered alongside ours by Brandon and Robert's actions. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The decision I'd made that day, to empty my accounts and vanish rather than surrender to Brandon's demands, had been the right one. Not just for me, but for all of us. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. And sometimes, walking away is what makes it possible to find your way back to what truly matters. Laura's face when she saw Diane standing in our living room was a complex mixture of emotions: surprise, wariness, and something like compassion. The children, spotting their paternal grandmother through the window, raced inside with conflicting reactions. Emily flinging herself into Diane's arms while Thomas held back, observing cautiously from a distance. "Grandma Diane!" Emily exclaimed. "Did you bring us presents?" Diane knelt, embracing her granddaughter with a trembling smile. "Not today, sweetheart. I just came to visit, to see how you're all doing." "Dad's in jail," Emily informed her solemnly. "And he doesn't want to be our dad anymore." Diane flinched slightly but maintained her composure. "I know, honey. It's complicated grown-up stuff. But he loves you very much." Laura stepped forward, her expression guarded. "Mom, could you take the kids to get ice cream? I think Diane and I need to talk privately." I nodded, understanding the significance of this moment between my daughter and her former mother-in-law. "Come on, you two. Let's see if the ice cream shop has that rainbow sherbet you like, Emily." As I ushered the children out, I caught a glimpse of Laura gesturing Diane toward the kitchen table, the traditional setting for our family's most important conversations. Whatever passed between them that afternoon marked a turning point, not reconciliation exactly, but a tentative truce born of shared pain and concern for the children. When we returned, sticky-fingered and sugar-buzzed, Diane was preparing to leave. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her posture was more upright, as if some invisible burden had been partially lifted. "Eleanor," she said, extending her hand as she passed me in the hallway. "Laura has invited me to Sunday dinner next week. I hope that's all right with you." "Of course," I replied, genuinely meaning it. "This is her home too." A flicker of respect passed through Diane's eyes, perhaps the first time she'd ever looked at me that way. "You're a remarkable woman," she said quietly. "I misjudged you. All these years I thought, you thought I wasn't good enough?" I finished for her. "Not wealthy enough, not sophisticated enough, not connected enough." She had the grace to look embarrassed. "Yes, and how wrong I was. True worth isn't measured in bank accounts or social standing. If Robert and I had understood that, perhaps things would have turned out differently." After she left, Laura shared parts of their conversation. Diane had come not just to thank us, but to make amends in her own way. Her life had been shattered by Robert's crimes and subsequent disappearance. The mansion in Coral Gables had been seized, her social circle had evaporated, and she was now living in a modest apartment, working as an assistant manager at a high-end boutique, her first job since college. "She's offering to help with the kids," Laura explained. "Not financially, she can't, but with time. Picking them up from school sometimes, watching them if I need to work late. She says she wants to be part of their lives, to give them at least one grandparent from Brandon's side of the family." "How do you feel about that?" I asked. Laura sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Conflicted. She was never particularly warm to me or the kids before all this happened, but she seems genuinely changed by everything. And the children need all the love and support they can get right now." "People can surprise you," I observed. "Sometimes it takes losing everything to discover what truly matters." Laura gave me a pointed look. "Like when my mom emptied her bank accounts and disappeared to teach me a lesson about greed?" I smiled ruefully. "Not my finest moment, I'll admit. But it worked, didn't it?" She laughed, a genuine sound that had become more frequent in recent months. "It did. Though next time, maybe just try a strongly worded letter first?" Over the next several months, Laura pursued her plan to establish a separate household for herself and the children. With my blessing and some financial assistance, a proper gift this time, not a loan or an obligation, she found a small 3-bedroom rental house just 4 blocks away. Close enough for the children to easily move between the two homes, but far enough to give Laura the independence she craved. The day they moved in, a sunny Saturday in early April, was bittersweet. The children were excited about their new rooms, which they had helped decorate themselves. Thomas had chosen a space theme, his ceiling now adorned with glow-in-the-dark stars arranged in accurate constellations. Emily had indeed gotten her purple room, the walls a soft lavender complemented by butterfly decals and fairy lights strung around the windows. I had worried that my house would feel too empty without them, but to my surprise, the transition felt natural, even necessary. Laura needed to prove to herself that she could stand on her own, build a life independent of both Brandon and me. And I needed to reclaim some of the peaceful solitude I'd found during my time in Cedar Key, balanced now with the joy of having family nearby rather than completely alone. True to her word, Laura brought the children over for dinner twice a week. Sunday evenings became a larger family gathering, with Diane occasionally joining us, her initial awkwardness gradually giving way to a more comfortable presence. She never tried to replace me as the maternal grandmother figure, instead carving out her own unique relationship with Emily and Thomas, one based on museum visits, nature walks, and quiet conversations that seemed to benefit her as much as the children. Brandon's sentencing came in late summer, almost a year after his arrest. 7 years in a federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 5. The news stirred up difficult emotions for everyone, particularly the children. Emily cried, herself to sleep that night, while Thomas retreated into a stony silence broken only when I gently coaxed him into helping me bake his favorite chocolate chip cookies. "Is it wrong that I'm still mad at him?" Thomas asked as we spooned dough onto baking sheets. "Even though he's being punished already?" "Not at all," I assured him. "You can be angry and sad and confused all at the same time. Your feelings are your own, Thomas. No one can tell you they're wrong." He nodded thoughtfully, methodically spacing the cookie dough. Mom says he did one good thing, giving up his rights so the bad men couldn't take anything else from us. Your mother's right. I agreed. That was a selfless choice. But it still hurts, he said simply. Yes, I acknowledged. It still hurts. Laura faced her own challenges as she rebuilt her life. The stigma of Brandon's crimes followed her in subtle ways. Invitations not extended, whispers at school functions, the occasional pointed question about whether she had known all along. She handled it with a dignity that made me fiercely proud, never defending Brandon's actions but also refusing to perform public condemnation to satisfy others' curiosity or judgment. Her professional life, at least, was flourishing. The small marketing firm had promoted her to senior account manager within 6 months, recognizing her talent and work ethic. She was earning less than she had during the Brandon years, but there was a quiet pride in knowing that everything she provided for her children now came from her own efforts. For my part, I found myself unexpectedly busy in what I had once assumed would be my quiet retirement years. With Laura and the children nearby but not underfoot, I rediscovered old interests and developed new ones. I joined a watercolor class at the community center, volunteered at the local library's literacy program, and even began dating casually. Nothing serious, just occasional dinner companions, mostly widowers from my church or friends of Phil's. 1. Such dinner companion, a retired high school principal named Howard, became a more regular fixture in my life. He was kind, intellectual without being pretentious, and had a dry wit that reminded me of Frank in the best possible way. We enjoyed museum exhibits, community theater performances, and long conversations over coffee about everything from politics to poetry. "You're glowing these days, Mom," Laura observed after Howard had joined us for Sunday dinner and charmed everyone, including Diane. "He's good for you." "We're just friends," I demurred, though we both knew there was potential for more. "You deserve happiness," she said simply. "After everything, you deserve it more than anyone." 2 years to the day after I had first discovered Brandon listing my house without my permission, the catalyst that had sent me fleeing with my emptied bank accounts, I found myself sitting in the courtroom where Robert Reynolds was finally facing justice. He had been captured in Panama 6 months earlier, extradited to face the charges he'd fled from. I hadn't planned to attend the sentencing hearing, but Laura had asked me to accompany her. "I need to see it end," she'd explained. "To look him in the eye, just once, and let him see that we survived what he and Brandon did to us." Diane sat on Laura's other side, her face a mask of contained emotion as she watched her ex-husband shuffle into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. Robert looked diminished, his once imposing presence reduced to that of an ordinary man facing the consequences of extraordinary greed. When the judge asked if any victims wished to make a statement, Laura surprised me by standing. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the slight trembling of her hands. "My name is Laura Harper, formerly Reynolds. My ex-husband Brandon Reynolds participated in his father's scheme, and as a result, my children and I lost our home, our financial security, and our family unit. But we didn't lose everything." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. 2 years ago, my former father-in-law and ex-husband were wealthy men by conventional standards. They had the houses, the cars, the lifestyle many people envy. I thought we were fortunate. I thought we had everything. Robert stared straight ahead, refusing to meet her gaze, but Laura continued undeterred. "I was wrong. What I have now, what my children have, is far more valuable. We have authenticity. We have resilience. We have relationships based on love and mutual respect, rather than materialism and appearances. We're building a life based on honest work and genuine connections." She turned slightly, looking directly at Robert for the first time. "I don't wish you ill, Mr. Reynolds. I hope you find some measure of peace during your incarceration. But more than that, I hope you someday understand that in pursuing wealth, at any cost, You sacrifice the only things that truly matter in this life. The courtroom was silent as Laura returned to her seat. I squeezed her hand, too moved for words, while Diane dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Later, as we walked out of the courthouse into the bright autumn sunshine, Laura linked her arms through mine and Diane's, an unconscious gesture that spoke volumes about how far we'd all come. "Well," she said with a small smile, "that chapter is finally closed. And a new one begins," I added, thinking of all that lay ahead. Thomas entering middle school, Emily's growing talent for art, Laura's recent promotion to creative director at her firm. "I've been thinking," Laura said as we walked toward the parking lot. "Maybe it's time to make some of these changes official. I'd like to go back to using my maiden name, Harper, and I think the kids should too. A fresh start, completely separate from the Reynolds legacy." Diane stiffened slightly beside her, and Laura quickly added, "This isn't about cutting you out, Diane. You'll always be their grandmother. It's about giving them a clean slate, an identity untainted by everything that's happened." After a moment, Diane nodded. "I understand, and I think it's the right decision." That evening, we had an impromptu celebration at my house. Laura, the children, Diane, Phil and his wife, Howard, and a few of Laura's close friends who had stood by her throughout the ordeal. It wasn't planned as such, but as people gathered, on my back porch, sharing food and conversation under strings of garden lights, it felt like a meaningful commemoration. "A toast," Phil announced, raising his glass. "To the Harper family. May your future be as bright as your spirits." "To the Harpers," everyone echoed, glasses clinking in the twilight. Later, as the party wound down, I found myself alone with Laura at the kitchen counter, putting away leftovers and loading the dishwasher. "I never properly thanked you," she said suddenly, pausing with a serving bowl in her hands. "For what?" I asked, though I suspected I knew. "For having the courage to walk away when you did. For showing me that sometimes the bravest thing isn't staying and fighting, it's recognizing when a situation is toxic and removing yourself from it." She placed the bowl in the dishwasher carefully. "If you hadn't emptied your accounts and vanished, I might never have seen Brandon for who he really was. The children and I might have been dragged down with him when everything collapsed." I reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a maternal gesture I'd been making since she was a little girl. "You would have figured it out eventually. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." "Maybe," she acknowledged. "But I'm glad I didn't have to find out the hard way. Looking at my daughter now, confident, self-sufficient, clear-eyed, about both her past mistakes and future possibilities, I felt a surge of pride so powerful it almost took my breath away. She had weathered a storm that might have broken a lesser person, emerging not just intact, but somehow more authentic, more fully herself. "What about you, Mom?" she asked, closing the dishwasher and turning to face me. "Any regrets about how everything turned out?" I considered the question seriously. Did I regret the months of exile, the dramatic rupture with my daughter, the upheaval that had touched all our lives? Perhaps I should. And yet, no, I said finally. No regrets. I wish we could have learned these lessons less painfully. But I don't regret where we've landed, Laura smiled, understanding completely. Me neither. 5 years after my disappearance, on a perfect June evening, we gathered in my backyard for Thomas's high school graduation party. At 16, he had completed high school a year early and been accepted to the State University's engineering program on a partial scholarship, the remainder covered by the trust fund I had established for the grandchildren all those years ago. The yard was filled with people who had become important parts of our expanded family circle. Howard, now my husband of 2 years. Diane and her new partner, Richard, a kind-hearted accountant she'd met at church. Phil and his wife. Laura's colleagues and friends, and Thomas's classmates and teachers. Emily, now 14 and blossoming into a talented artist, had created a photo display chronicling her brother's accomplishments. Looking at the images, Thomas receiving academic awards, performing in the school band, laughing with friends, a casual observer would never guess the challenges our family had overcome. Laura, elegant in a simple blue dress, gave a toast that brought tears to my eyes. To my brilliant son, who taught me what true resilience looks like, and to my mother, who showed us all that it's never too late to set boundaries, stand up for yourself, and rewrite your own story. As glasses clinked and congratulations flowed, I found myself standing slightly apart, taking in the scene with a full heart. The garden Frank had loved was in full bloom, tended now by Howard's careful hands alongside mine. The house that Brandon had tried to sell out from under me had become the heart of our extended family, hosting celebrations and Sunday dinners, a sanctuary where healing had gradually replaced hurt. Thomas approached, handsome in the new suit we'd bought for the occasion, a young man now where a bewildered boy had once stood. "Penny for your thoughts, Grandma?" he asked, handing me a fresh glass of lemonade. "Just counting my blessings," I replied with a smile, and marveling at how life's hardest challenges often lead to unexpected gifts. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Mom says that's why our family motto should be, 'Sometimes you have to empty your accounts and vanish.'" I laughed, delighted by Laura's irreverent summary of our journey. A bit long for a coat of arms, perhaps, but accurate nonetheless. Thomas's smile faded slightly. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't done that? If you'd just given Dad and Grandpa Robert your money when they wanted it?" I considered his question, gazing across the yard to where Laura stood chatting with Howard, her head thrown back in laughter at something he'd said. "I expect it would have delayed the inevitable," I said finally. "Their scheme would still have collapsed eventually. But you, your mother, Emily, you might have been more deeply entangled when it did, and our relationships might not have healed the way they have." He nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. "I'm glad you stood up for yourself, Grandma. I think about that a lot, actually. How one person's courage can change everything." As he moved away to rejoin his friends, I caught Laura's eye across the yard. She raised her glass slightly in my direction, a private acknowledgement passing between us. My son-in-law had demanded I hand over my life savings, so I'd emptied my accounts and vanished. In doing so, I'd not only protected my financial independence, but had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately saved something far more valuable: the true heart of our family, stripped of pretense and materialism, rebuilt on a foundation of honesty, resilience, and unconditional love. Sometimes the bravest choice is to walk away, and sometimes that choice leads you right back to where you truly belong, changed, strengthened, and finally free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.